6 people were killed with a mattock on a small Bavarian farm in 1922. The killer stayed on the property for at least 3 more days, feeding the cattle and cooking meals in the kitchen while the bodies lay in the barn and the house. How does someone slaughter an entire family, then calmly live inside the crime scene for days and still vanish without ever being identified? The first real clue arrived not from a detective, but from a mechanic who came to fix a broken engine. Over the next few minutes, we will walk through the timeline of Hinterkaifeck, the 6 victims, the footprints in the snow that led to the farm but never left, the strangers seen near the property, and the single detail investigators overlooked for decades. Detail number 3 is the one that still troubles German cold case researchers today. If you follow unsolved cases like this, subscribe. On dark cases, we cover a new one every week. To understand Hinterkaifeck, you first have to understand how isolated it was. The farmstead sat in a shallow depression between the villages of Grobern and Wangen in Upper Bavaria, roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich. It was not a village. It was not even a hamlet. It was a single working farm, ringed by fields and a strip of forest, connected to the outside world by muddy paths that turned to ice in winter. The nearest neighbor was several hundred meters away. On a still night, a scream from Hinterkaifeck would have traveled a long way through the trees, and no one would have known where to look. In late March 1922, 6 people lived there. Andreas Gruber was 63 years old, a hard, quarrelsome farmer with a reputation for cruelty. His wife Cecilia was 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was 35. Victoria had 2 children, a 7-year-old girl also named Cecilia, and a 2-year-old boy, Josef. Living with them was a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived at the farm only hours before the killings. She was in her mid-40s and had never spent a full night at Hinterkaifeck. She would not survive her first one. The final resident of the household was gone by then. The previous maid, Crescence Rieger, had left the farm about 6 months earlier. She would later tell investigators that she quit because she was convinced the house was haunted. She said she had heard footsteps in the attic, voices, strange sounds she could not explain. At the time, everyone dismissed it as the excuse of a superstitious country girl. In hindsight, it may have been the only warning the family ever received. In the days before the murders, Andreas Gruber himself began to notice things that did not add up. He told neighbors he had found a newspaper on the farm that no one in the family subscribed to. He said he had seen fresh footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest to the machine house, but none leading back. He mentioned hearing footsteps in the attic at night. He even climbed up there to look and found nothing. According to statements collected later, Gruber also reported that a set of house keys had gone missing. He did not call the police. He did not ask for help. He simply kept the observations to himself and to a few local acquaintances. This is one of the most disturbing elements of the Hinterkaifeck case. The family may have known for days that someone was watching them and possibly living in their own attic, and they chose to do nothing about it. Whether Gruber was too proud, too stubborn, or simply did not believe the danger was real, we will never know. What we do know is that on the evening of Friday, March 31st, 1922, something inside that farmhouse ended 6 lives in a matter of minutes. The murders themselves were carried out with a rothau, a heavy mattock used for breaking hard soil. Investigators later concluded that the killer waited in or near the barn. One by one, the members of the household were lured or driven into the animal shed. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and the little girl Cecilia were all killed there, struck in the head with the mattock. Then the killer walked calmly across the yard, back into the house. Inside, in a small bedroom, the 2-year-old Josef was killed in his cot. In the maid's room, Maria Baumgartner was killed in her bed on the night she had arrived. 6 victims. 3 generations of a single family, plus a stranger who had come to work for them. Everything about the attack suggests a person who knew the layout of the farm and knew the routines of the household. The killer did not stumble around in the dark. They knew where each person slept. They knew which door led to the barn, which door led to the kitchen, and how to move between them without alerting anyone. That knowledge is one of the reasons investigators have always believed the killer had been inside the house before. What happened next is arguably the strangest part of the entire case. The killer did not run. Neighbors later reported that smoke had continued to rise from the chimney of Hinterkaifeck for days after the family fell silent. When police finally entered the house, they found that meals had been prepared and eaten in the kitchen. Bread had been cut. Someone had fed the cattle in the barn, stepping around or over the bodies to do so. The dog, which had been found tied up and injured but alive, had been given water. In other words, whoever killed the Gruber family stayed at Hinterkaifeck for at least 3 days, moving through the rooms, using the stove, working the farm, sleeping somewhere on the property. And then, at some point between April 1st and April 4th, they simply left. No one saw them arrive. No one saw them go. Here is the mini cliffhanger before we move on. The first person to notice something was wrong was not a policeman, not a relative, and not a priest. It was a mechanic with a broken coffee machine. On Tuesday, April 4th, 1922, the postman, Josef Mayer, arrived at the farm with mail. He noticed that letters he had delivered on Saturday were still lying where he had left them, untouched. That alone should have been unusual, but the postman continued on his route. That same day, little Cecilia did not appear at school in Wangen. She had already missed several days. Her teacher was uneasy, but did not act. In the afternoon, 3 men from the neighborhood, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Jakob Siegel, and Mikkel Pearl, walked to Hinterkaifeck. Schlittenbauer had a specific reason to check on the family. He had a paternity dispute with Victoria Gabriel. He had allegedly been named as the father of little Joseph. The 3 men entered the barn first. There, under a layer of hay and an old door, they found the 4 bodies stacked almost neatly on top of each other. Andreas, Cecilia the elder, Victoria, and little Cecilia. It is here that one of the most controversial moments of the investigation occurred. Schlittenbauer, according to later testimony, appeared to know exactly where to look. He climbed over the bodies, moved objects, and eventually forced open the door of the house from the inside. When asked later how he had known the door could be opened that way, and why he had shown no visible shock, he gave answers that never fully satisfied investigators. Inside the house, the men found the body of Joseph in his cot and Maria Baumgartner in her bed. Then they called the authorities. By the time the Munich detectives arrived the next day, the scene had already been contaminated. Dozens of neighbors had walked through the barn, through the house, through the kitchen. Warm meals, dishes, footprints, fingerprints, everything had been disturbed. The investigators, led by Inspector Jörg Reingruber, still tried to work the case methodically. They took photographs. They interviewed more than 100 people. They noted the mysterious observations Andreas Gruber had made in the days before his death. The strange newspaper, the missing keys, the footprints in the snow, the sounds in the attic. And now we come to the numbered detail promised at the beginning of this video. The third one, the one that still troubles cold case researchers today. When police examined the attic of the farmhouse, they found signs that someone had been living up there, not passing through. Living. There were traces suggesting food had been consumed in the attic. There were indications that a person had slept there. The killer, in all likelihood, had been hiding inside Hinterkaifeck for days, possibly weeks, before the murders, listening to the family below, learning their movements, eating their food while they slept. Andreas Gruber had heard footsteps because there really were footsteps. The killer was in the house the whole time. Suspects were named almost immediately, and the list has only grown over the last century. The most persistent suspect in local rumor has always been Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His behavior at the scene, his familiarity with the farm, his personal conflict with Victoria over the child Joseph, and his apparent calm on discovering the bodies made him an obvious focus. But Schlittenbauer was never charged. He successfully sued neighbors who accused him publicly, and he lived out the rest of his life in the area. Investigators believe the evidence against him was suggestive, but never conclusive. A second theory pointed to Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who had reportedly been killed in the trenches of the First World War in France in 1914. His body was never conclusively identified. Some in the village whispered that he had returned from the war years later, discovered what had happened in his absence, and taken revenge. There were even Cold War-era stories, never verified, claiming that Soviet officers after the Second World War had told German authorities that a captured man had confessed to the Hinterkaifeck murders. None of it was ever confirmed. It remains, in the careful language of German investigators, unbestätigt, unconfirmed. Other theories have included wandering criminals, deserters from the war, someone with a grudge against Andreas Gruber, and even a family member acting alone. In 1986, the case was formally reopened. In 2007, students at the Polizeifachhochschule in Fürstenfeldbruck used modern criminological methods to re-examine every surviving file. They identified a prime suspect. They did not release the name, out of respect for the person's living relatives, and because the case still could not be proven. It has never been proven since. There is one more detail that has haunted the story of Hinterkaifeck for a century, and it is a physical one. In the weeks after the murders, the farm buildings were demolished. Officially, this was because the property was uninhabitable and the family had no heirs willing to take it on. Unofficially, locals were terrified of the place and wanted it gone. During the demolition, workers found the murder weapon, the mattock, hidden in the attic. This is the detail that closes the loop. The killer had used a tool from the farm itself, then returned it to the attic where they had been hiding, and left it there when they walked away. The bodies of the 6 victims were buried in the cemetery at Weidhofen. Their skulls, however, were sent to Munich for forensic examination and were never returned. During the chaos of the Second World War, those skulls were lost. Today, we do not even have the remains of the victims to test with modern DNA techniques. Whatever secrets their bones might have carried are gone. A small shrine now stands on the site where the farmhouse used to be, at the edge of a quiet field. Visitors leave flowers and candles for a family who died more than 100 years ago, in a case that was never solved, committed by a person who was never named, and who in all likelihood walked back into the same countryside from which they had come, and simply disappeared into the ordinary life of interwar Bavaria. If this case stayed with you the way it stays with us, do one thing before you close the tab. Subscribe to Dark Cases and turn on notifications. Every week we take another unsolved file apart, carefully, respectfully, and without inventing what we do not know. The next case is already on the board.